Hello, I'm David Sillars, and I played the part of Phil Donan in the Shattered podcast, which I really hope you enjoyed as much as we enjoyed doing it. And after all, everyone loves a mystery, don't they? Now, perhaps you learned a little bit about the history of audio technology listening to Shattered. For instance, do you now know that the earliest sound recording was made on the Phonograph in 1856? I wasn't there. If you did enjoy Shattered and you enjoyed learning about audio recording history and things like that, you might like to take part in a little questionnaire, a little survey that we have going on. First of all, we'd like you to look at the history of sound recording in Shattered, which is a short documentary. And, there's a link and more information. Can't quite see down there somewhere. And you'll find more details and information there in the description. Thank you very much for your support. Bye.
In the early 1900s, the great and good at the Paris Opera buried an urn full of living voices, gramophone recordings of famous opera stars, to be disinterred after a century. When those urns were opened, mysterious recordings, similar to experiments done by Alexander Graham Bell at the Volta laboratories in Washington, D.C. in 1881, were discovered. Who made them? And why?
I wanted to do a version of Phantom of the Opera that tapped into the history of sound recording, from really the very earliest through LPs and into the medium upon which you are hearing this, which is digital.
During the 19th century, it's such a long time ago, and yet so many of the skills and the elements of preservation in recording are still the same today.
In the Shattered podcast, Phil Donan and Nemo used
research, sound recording playback technology, and good old-fashioned detective work to try to find you the answers.
And this documentary is going to give you some more insight into the various recording technologies mentioned in the podcast.
Hi, I'm Leslie McMurtry. I'm the writer and producer of Shattered. There's a great website called the Museum of Imaginary Musical Instruments, created by Deirdre Lockridge and Thomas Pattison. In it, they describe this frozen hunting horn, which comes from the adventures of the Baron Munchausen. The idea is that the horn is so cold that it won't sound, it won't play, until it thaws and then autonomously resounds with these notes that were frozen inside it. I love this idea because it represents to me the human fascination with wanting to record and repurpose and conserve sound. And in this particular example, it's music. This is an idea that dates back a long time, but it's something that could only start to be realized in the 19th century.
So my name is Dorota Babilas. I work at the Institute of English Studies at the University of Warsaw in Poland. I'm an assistant professor there.
Playing a musical instrument was quite an important skill in the Victorian period, especially among the middle class. It became popular. It was also an important accomplishment for young ladies, intended to make them better wives and hostesses in the future. Of course, any kind of music that the Victorians could enjoy for most of the period was live, so there needed to be someone who could play an instrument. When the upright piano was invented in England in the 1820s, it very quickly eclipsed all other instruments. It became the most popular instrument in the mid-Victorian and late Victorian home. First of all, it was cheaper and took less space than the grand piano, so it could fit very nicely into smaller middle-class homes. Also, it had two important advantages. One was that the piano could be played by two people simultaneously, so-called with four hands. So it became a very socially acceptable form of flirtation, popular among young unmarried people who wanted to spend some time with people they were attracted to. It was also fairly easy to accompany oneself or another while singing.
I come from a family of musicians, but weirdly enough, I got into recorded sound through being interested in radio and then teaching a module on sound studies at the University of Salford. And that module connects music and sound recording, among other things.
Debussy did record some arias from Palais Garnier with Mary Garden, and he is accompanying her on the piano, but he didn't make any solo recordings. He made some on piano rolls, but I better not start on piano rolls because
If we include the player pianos or the self-playing pianos, they also appear in the Victorian period, but for most of the Victorian period they were not really a popular thing in private homes. They were a kind of technical curiosity to be shown at first. However, later, at the turn of the century and into the interwar period, it became cheaper, so some people started to buy player pianos for their private homes. So rather than be left with asking somebody to play the real instrument, they had a mechanical machine that could produce music.
I'm fascinated by musical machines like player pianos, so I had to include one in Shattered, the pianola that leads Nemo to speak to Monsieur Xavier.
And once Phil and I had been introduced over Skype, we were able to find someone with a player piano in Paris, who I lent the piano roll to, and he made a lovely recording for us.
In Shattered, Meg Giry, in addition to ending up as the Baroness de Castelot-Balbezac, also becomes something of a sheet music tycoon.
But I'm just as proud of my days as a businesswoman. At Paris, I was l'impératrice des imprimantes. That is to say, I managed with great success our print works with my husband. We specialized in les partitions, printed music.
My name's Dr. Mark Duffett. I'm a reader at the University of Chester. Well, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, people were using sheet music at home on player pianos, and they were using either devices that produced music, whether that was kind of mechanical musical instruments or eventually kind of gramophones and things. So you had home devices that would produce music, or you had just musical instruments at home that you could use. And people like now, when we think of downloading a stream or listening to a Spotify stream, back in those days it was more a case of going out, buying sheet music, perhaps from somebody on a street corner that was singing the song that they were selling, and then taking it home, reading the music and playing it and reproducing standards in your living room or parlour, and that was the culture of popular music.
Evan Eisenberg, in his book The Recording Angel, makes a really interesting point.
Not everyone can play an instrument or sing a harmony part, but anyone can play a record.
They became democratized. This is a popular technology. You can get hold of it. You can get hold of it pretty cheaply. It can have its benefits for you. And some of the early newspaper adverts for recording devices, gramophones and things, were saying, even a child could operate this. So the way that what we would now call engaged fans, if you like, were discussed in these early years was to locate them as like individuals especially engaged with music. The negative name for them at that time would be melomaniacs. In other words, melody has got into their head and turned them insane.
Okay, I'm listening. What am I listening for? A voice. In the music.
But it wasn't really until about the 1920s they actually even see the term fan becoming used popularly in the press. I think one of the sort of turning points in the development of these kind of relationships was the emergence of star opera singers, and the obvious example there would be Enrico Caruso.
1902 is when the first Caruso recordings were made. Caruso was issued on a red label, or was it pink?
Okay, Caruso. Now that's a name I recognise.
Whose work at the New York Metropolitan Opera helped cement and consolidate his superstardom as a singer. And when he was on trial in America for a supposed sexual misdemeanor. The response to his fans, that I believe one of the police, I think it was, attending court, called them something like curs, dogs and perverts. And so there was this negative reaction against music listeners.
But we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves. How does sound recording actually start?
The phonogram. I love the phonogram.
Its inventor was a bookseller. I mean, he wasn't an engineer or a doctor, but his fascination was simply in the mechanics of the ear. What he really wanted to do was to mimic it mechanically, how the tympanium and the ossicles and all the bits of the ear worked, and see if he could sort of mechanically reproduce it to show other people.
With the point being, he mainly wanted to record sound in a written form. So it's Alexander Graham Bell in the 1880s who builds on Léon Scott de Martinville's work, while Thomas Edison is working on something similar in the 1870s.
My name is Howard Hope, and so quite a lot of bad blood was left behind him. But all these 19th century inventors, when there was a lot of money to be made by selling it, exploiting it, a lot of principles went right out of the window. And Edison's a fine example of that as well. Alexander Graham Bell starts off quite romantic because he had a deaf mother and he took a deaf wife. It seems quite pure at the beginning that he has quite altruistic reasons behind wanting to work on sound reproducing equipment. The idea of sound and deafness as opposed to sound and hearing, as with the phonograph, he stood on the shoulders of many men who got very close to the answer. Several other people really had done 9/10 of the work that Bell had done.
I'm going to call it the Volta cylinder, which is catchier than saying that it's kind of like the experimental recordings Alexander Graham Bell was doing at the Volta laboratories in 1881.
The pre-Volta was quite an unusual prize because, unlike something like a Nobel Prize, where you're looking for something that is exceptional in the sense of being exceptionally advanced or exceptionally imaginative, the pre-Volta was unusual because the French government gave it in response to the invention which was of most public use or most public benefit. And because acoustics and sound production were his interest, he went into partnership with a friend called Charles Sumner Tainter and his cousin Chichester Bell, who was in England. Bell himself being a Scot by origins, but at this time they hadn't actually formed a company, and they set up in Washington, initially in Bell's own home. There was no real science behind acoustics at that time, so they were almost using their money to find out how things worked at all.
My name's Dr. Peter Martland. I was an academic, I was a historian of the recording industry, and I worked at the University of Cambridge. I was able to unpack the very beginnings of this new industry, and like all new technology industry, it was one that had wonderful rogues and scoundrels. Kiss me quick, get rich quick people.
I mean, for instance, Edison later on, they experimented with horns. Is cardboard better than brass, better than wood, better than steel?
It wasn't just the material of the horn, it was the material of the cylinders too.
The amplifying horn, which has come to be associated as visual signifier of the gramophone.
I have seen and heard an early cylinder made of celluloid, this kind of plastic, and they're sort of the size and shape of a toilet paper roll. And I became fascinated by the early cylinder sound recordings, this idea of recording on a cylinder shape and then this DIY attitude to trying all these different materials to record things on. I thought Eric would have been an experimenter like that. I could see him trying to perfect sound recording.
And you invented all this, did you? Naturally. I read the newspapers. Hadn't Thomas Edison? A trifle. This is a design and improvement to my own specifications. Believe me when I play it back.
Famously, Edison was very busy, having invented the tinfoil phonograph in 1877. Edison was very busy onto what would have been huge money spinners. So although he loved the phonograph, Edison couldn't see where it was going and put it on the burner. And famously, the Volta people started quite early, by which I mean about 1883 or 1884, they started making machines. And then Bell basically went to Edison and said, look, you invented this thing, I've got a whole heap of money. why don't we just go in together and we'll do a deal?
Musicians have no idea how you create markets, as the people who founded the record industry did, for a total novelty. Utter and complete. There was no parallel before sound recording that one knows with Edison's first patent. There were no challenges to it because there was nothing prior to it.
The problem came when Bell offered Edison a 50-50 money split, which ignited a bitter rivalry between the two, causing sound recording technology to go down some dead ends in evolutionary terms.
And the whole history of sound reproduction, the whole history, is arguments between people who've got patents.
Into the 1890s, recording on cylinders stayed a novelty, or was used in business dictation.
I'm Murray Leeder. I'm a film scholar currently posted at the University of Manitoba. So the wax cylinders in the novel Dracula play a small but I think kind of crucial role. So one of the main narrators of the novel is Dr. John Seward. He's a doctor, he's a professional, he runs a sanitarium in London where Renfield is being examined. And he's recording all of his notes, all of his diaries on phonograph, so they're being recorded onto wax cylinders. And he remarks on when he doesn't have the cylinders anymore, how onerous it is to have to keep a diary in longhand and so on.
Well, I'm David Ault, and I am lucky enough to play Eric, the Phantom of the Opera. So in terms of historical sound recording, I knew about the wax cylinders. At the local science museum in Birmingham when I was a child, there was a mock-up of a wax cylinder, and you could turn it and it would play Mary Had a Little Lamb, which was, I think, the first recording on a wax cylinder.
As Peter Adamson explains,
any sort of recording, not just Berliner's discs, no, cylinders as well. They all had the same propensity for making popular music easier to consume. And as the prices came down, which they have done ever since 1900, it's got easier and easier. Recorded music has never been cheap.
Emil Berliner was a German immigrant to the United States who supplied the technology for mass-producing discs, as opposed to cylinders in early sound recording technology.
Discs, or records, had many advantages over cylinders.
And that was the big advantage of Berliner's process, was that it was easy to reproduce the original, unlike a cylinder. Apparently, cylinders being made of the softer wax have less background noise, but they possibly more prone to wear. Discs had to be made of much tougher material because they're actually underneath the heavy weight of a playback mechanism, whereas the cylinders then had very, very delicate playback mechanisms. On the other hand, cylinders have a rather small diameter, so any deviation from circular produces a very strong wobble in the pitch. The gramophone, it was said to sound like a parrot with a bad cold.
Cylinders and discs existed side by side for some time, and it was up to you as the listener as to what your personal preference was.
Discs at that time became somewhat interchangeable with the word gramophone. So you would technically be listening to a gramophone disc recording, but you might just say you were listening to the gramophone.
So today, in the 21st century, if we want some analog listening, we listen to discs. Why not cylinders?
And there's another reason, and that is that certainly in the UK, which was a little bit quicker off the mark than the US because Edison had so much commercial power in America, but in Britain and Europe, discs outsold cylinders by about 1905. Between 1904 and 1906, discs really began to overtake the sales. And in 1906, the two biggest companies, Columbia for the American side, but they also had European interests, and Pathé Frères, both dropped cylinders and went 100% to discs, over which they had commercial rights, as did Victor in the USA. Edison had no disc patents of his own whatsoever, so he's suddenly half out of the game. Many people who liked the repertoire on cylinders would keep on buying cylinders and have a cylinder phonograph on one side of the room and a disc gramophone on the other side, so that they could enjoy both.
The gramophone industry was one driven by rapid expansion, and cutthroat business deals.
I think the best thing that I found recently was to pinpoint the exact location of the first gramophone studio in London. Now, everybody knew the address, which was 31 Maiden Lane, near the Strand. So I proved it was on the first floor. And they're getting all the supplies being sailed across from America, records and gramophones, in enormous quantities. Thousands and thousands and thousands of gramophones and records were being shipped across by 1898. It was tremendously popular over here. But they had this emergency, so they had to send somebody. They had to speed up the process of getting started in Europe. Getting started in making recordings in Europe, and actually manufacturing in Europe. So Fred Geisberg was part of that strategy. He was sent post haste with machinery and had to get things sorted out. He brought the equipment across, but all his chemicals and zinc and everything like that was all obtained over here. It took him a week to get started. So setting up, they had to get the room, had to get the stuff into the room. They had to get all the metal and chemicals and everything, supplies, and the beeswax and the alcohol and all that sort of thing. I know where they got the alcohol from. The gin manufacturer. Ideal. All he needed was the ice. They used to have parties, you know.
I bet they did.
Oh, they had parties, play their dance records and play the piano and things like that.
There's this weird mix in the early 20th century of entrepreneurial, try-anything spirit and ruthless business acumen, led by David Sarnoff, which is not surprising given how much of a stake he had in the history of radio.
The Gramophone Company was acquired by RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, and its head, David Sarnoff, became a director of the Gramophone Company.
Now, Sarnoff was not interested in records or gramophones, and certainly not mechanical engineering. And he acquired the Vix Company because of the capacity to manufacture radio receiving sets. Mm-hmm. And he came over for one of the very few board meetings he attended and told them bluntly, look, you've no future as a gramophone manufacturing facility. You need to get into radio. He forced them to buy Marconi phone, a horribly overpriced, a badly run company making huge losses. But EMI turned it round. And the key thing about Marconi phone is that it had a sub company called MOV, which manufactured light bulbs and valves, vacuum tubes, and made a huge profit. And two, it was part of a monopoly, of an oligopoly, a radio oligopoly. So if you wanted to manufacture radio, you had to pay this oligopoly. So Marconi phone got money. And there was nobody really in that field. And so it was the nearest competitor. So Alfred Clark, the head of the Gramophone Company, and Louis Sterling, the head of Columbia, who hated each other, were forced to work with each other in EMI and develop it as a major electrical manufacturing facility.
In 1925, electricity was introduced to playback technology.
Oh, well, it brings realism to the recording studios. It changes the management of recording studios. Before that time, the sound engineers, who were all empirically trained, had a variety of jobs. They had the management of the artist in the studio, as well as the making of the recording. After 1925, the engineer was an electrician.
So the choices for music listening in the 1920s were myriad: live, cylinder, gramophone disc, or on the radio.
Hi, this is Laura Frey. I'm playing the Baroness Castelot-Balbazac in Shattered. I actually was a professional broadcaster for 20 years. I did a morning breakfast show. Having performed live to an audience and performed behind a microphone, I can tell you they're two completely different things. What's very exciting about recording and performing behind a microphone is the intimacy. As a listener, certainly now, of course, I'm an avid listener as well. I love the company of broadcasting in the background, and I can imagine how precious those recordings were back in, 1920s, when people recorded music. And this was very exciting. You could have music there at your fingertips without having to pay a band and being able to afford an orchestra or whatever. So I can really see how recording in those days changed everything. And it didn't replace live music. That's what everyone must remember. There were fears at the time, oh my goodness, anything theatrical, it's over. But no, that did not happen. And radio the same.
By the 1940s, recording technology evolves yet again.
So if people want to find out about the history of LPs, they're going to go back before LPs. LPs in America, 1948, were micro-grooves, so they had a small groove. They were 33 1/3 RPM, and they're pressed in vinyl.
LPs, or long-playing discs, could hold more than the 78 RPM, revolutions per minute, gramophone discs could. LPs were also made of a different, more durable material, vinyl. Gramophone discs had been made of shellac, which is derived from the casings of an insect.
And by the late 50s, EMI and Decca are dropping the 7-inch 45 and extended play classical recordings and going simply for the long playing records, because that's clearly where their market is.
LPs started coming on the market in the late 40s, and that's more than 70 years ago. So early LPs are more, if you like, ancient than this 1896 Berliner was when I bought it.
Like many collectors, I started young. I got fascinated by an old record player that one of my relatives, I think, found in a garage sale. I got given it as a present, and when you're that age...
How old were you?
Probably about 7.
Okay.
It was a wind-up gramophone. It was easy to get a hold of discs to play on it because they were cheap and at that stage unwanted. Lots of people had them lying around their attics, so it wasn't hard to start collecting.
I included characters like Michael Charles, the Berliner disc collector, in Shattered, after talking to collectors from the City of London Phonograph and Gramophone Society, who were very gracious and generous with their time. I loved hearing about how they became collectors themselves.
So in other words, sound recordings are essentially for sharing. Somebody has recorded something in order that it should be shared. Well, I have to go back right to when I was a small boy, about 3 or 4. I was always interested in reproduction of sound because it's such a mysterious sort of thing. And I remember my parents had it must have been a second-hand radio because it didn't have a back on it. It was it was an old valve thing, which was probably just before the war, I would guess. It didn't have a back on it, so I think it must have been second-hand. And my father used to point out the valves in the back, blowing and things like that. And I was fascinated by this and hearing voices coming from it. And my father explained to me how this happened, and it fascinated me. And soon after that, again, it must have been second-hand. I believe they were given a portable wind-up gramophone, one of those black suitcase type things. And I always remember things like Uncle Mac of the Children's Hour, BBC Children's Hour, introducing nursery rhymes sung by soloists and children. Christopher Robin songs.
There is still a lot of popular interest in analog recording, mainly vinyl, but also tape cassettes. We didn't actually have any tape cassettes in Shattered. Darn it, missed one out.
The physical object often has very attractive properties. I mean, the discs are circular, which is a particularly attractive shape. The very serious problem of a design. How do you make a design in a circle? Which is really quite tricky. And the various approaches to this design, all down the years into modern times, has been quite interesting. So you get wonderful designs of labels. You've then got the aspect of playing the record, which has got a physical magic to it.
My name's Rod Henderson, and I am playing Simeon Entwistle. There is so much more. There's phonograph. There's all of these different things, and in my naivety, just assumed that all of these things from back then They were all effectively vinyl records. That's it. No, absolutely they're not. So this, even just listening to this, is absolutely an education. And what's quite nice is the whole, because we were saying about blurring the lines between fiction and reality. It's quite nice when you can, okay, I know that those bits are fact. Those are historical things. These are actual methods that we used. But then putting that veneer of fiction over the top of what they actually contain, I think is excellent. And the efforts through the script as well, to piece by piece by piece, we see the journey of digitizing it and so on and so forth, and getting bit by bit of what's actually being said has been really interesting for me as well.
One of the most boring things about the early recordings that we've got is they're all by noble people, and noble people all tend to speak the same. So if you listen to Gourod's records of British prime ministers, American politicians, P.T. Barnum, whatever it is, they've all got a sort of upper class stiffness which flattens any personality they have generally, and doesn't give you an awfully good idea of what the person would really have been like.
So for me, recording, perhaps the most exciting thing is you're recording a snapshot in time. Often it's very hard to recreate a recording. It is what it is at the time, and the fact that it's recorded means you can play it again and again and again. And as we have to remember, and as you know, is specifically in this particular drama, it's a snapshot in time, but it's not necessarily an accurate snapshot, and it is all about context.
My name is Fiona Thraille. In some way, hearing somebody's voice from the past is almost more meaningful than seeing them in a photograph.
I would love to have heard in 1850 what the man in the street sounded like. It would be lovely if, the Phonograph's, mailman, I'd like him to have come in and talked about his round, and to hear what kinds of words he used and what his accent sounded like in 1850 France, because the accent of people in 1880s and 1890s England is nothing like the accents you will hear anywhere, even amongst the upper classes anymore. Such voices are gone.
Because it is quite literally, I don't know, the way that the sound waves, I guess, hit your ears, and you are literally interacting with something that is left behind by somebody, which I think can be very powerful.
I would tell my story of years in India, Persia, Batavia, England, for no one need know who I am.
I am just a voice.
In Shattered, we follow the trajectory of music culture in the 19th century. To the earliest sound recording techniques.
The phonograph was invented in 1856, and basically what it did was etch sounds onto a round glass plate. In its wake was something called the parlophone, invented by Charles Cros.
And to the invention of the phonographic cylinder. Imagining what it would have been like had a character like Eric the Phantom dabbled in sound recording technology that was state-of-the-art in his time.
Believe me when I play it back.
And onto such recording forms as the gramophone.
I know how this works. Eric has one of these recording contraptions.
The gramophone disc. Off-air radio recordings.
Having penned her memoirs, she has graciously consented to tell her story over the wireless for the BBC.
Reel-to-reel magnetic
tape. For the purposes of this recording, could you please confirm your name?
My name is Christine Gaillet.
And beyond. We hope you've enjoyed learning more about the history of sound recording technology. If you'd like to learn more, there's probably a local or national society in your area for enthusiasts of recorded sound. Seek them out, keep listening, and keep learning. You have been listening to The Recording Angel, The Making of Shattered, narrated by me, Ivy Alvarez. If you like what you heard and learned something, please consider completing the questionnaire in the description below. Thanks to Dr. Dorota Babilas, Jamie Beckwith, Liz Beckwith-Wilches, Dr. Mark Duffett, Dr. Mary Leeder, David Ault, Emma Carter, Will Derenzi Martin, Laura Frey, Rod Henderson, Josie and Michael Herman, David Sillars, Fiona Thraille, Sebastian Touray, Kathy Westerline, and Robert Sholl. The Shattered podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of Brian Baker, Tony Cross, Joanne and Carl Donsbach, Will Forbes, Adam Fowler, Stephen Sauter, and Carol Renfro, Eileen Renfro, and Sally Renfro.
With special thanks to Peter Adamson, Howard Hope, Simon Hayes, Jolyon Hudson, Dr. Peter Martland, Christopher Proudfoot, and the City of London Phonograph and Gramophone Society for all of their help and advice. Music was composed and performed by Catherine Seaton and Robert Sholl, including a recording made on a 1900 Steinway & Sons piano in the Royal Academy of Music Piano Museum in London. The role of Christine was sung by Anna McCready, and the role of Eric was sung by Matt Pouchin. Additional music was by Gregor Quendel, used under Creative Commons Attribution No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Cinematic Cello Arpeggio, Fairy Tale Intro, Orchestral Arpeggio Suite, Percussion Sketch, Piano Sketch, Sentimental Lullaby Sketch, Celesta Only version, and Modern Orchestral Trailer. The following was used under an Attribution Non-Commercial 4.0 International License. A Rich Heart Doe by Johan van de Griff. The following was used under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Paris Gypsy Swing by Dieter van der Westen, and Piano Chocolate Waltz by Piano Chocolate. Maple Leaf Rag, 1899 Z. Brewster Geist version by Scott Joplin, was licensed under a Public Domain Mark 1.0 license. Eric Satie's Je n'en peux dire, No. 2, by Kevin MacLeod, was licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. This was a Lesser of Two Evils production, 2022.